Okay, so in the interest of time and a lot to get through today, I think this is a good place to start. Thank you, Nombulelo. So my name is Mpinani Songkhane Mahlaji, and I am a senior consultant of Reos Partners. I'm based in Johannesburg, where I think winter is now rapidly closing in on us. And I'd like to say a little bit about what we're doing here and why we've gathered together. For those of you who do not know, Reos Partners is an international social enterprise that is helping people move forward together on their most tough and intractable challenges. Generally, we design, facilitate, and guide multi-stakeholder events, processes, and platforms. We operate globally and locally with offices in Johannesburg, Cambridge, Geneva, London, Montreal, Sao Paulo. And some of our colleagues are here today. And we work on economic inclusion, education, energy and climate, health, equity, natural resources, land and food, peace and governance, and democracy, to name a few. But today, the purpose of our discussion is really to address a pressing social issue, systemically addressing racism in organizations requires a shift in societal norms, beliefs, and values. And at Reos, part of our system change work includes supporting our clients in addressing and dismantling structural racism in their organizational systems. And it's through this work we're learning about the complexity of these efforts. So in today's webinar, two of my colleagues will be sharing their experiences and thinking on dismantling structural racism following the recent publication on dismantling structural racism in organizational systems in the Journal of Awareness-Based Systems Change, co-written by three of them, two of whom you'll meet today. And with that, I think it's a great time for me to actually introduce our panelists, and I'll start with Akanimo Akpan, Dr. Akanimo Akpan. Akanimo is an organizational development, strategic management, and facilitation specialist with extensive experience in government and the development sector. He has supported a number of organizations in South Africa and internationally to improve their performances, and he brings a combination of skills that include critical analysis, synthetic thinking, and project management and leadership in a bid to support cross-sectoral teams to move forward together on these shared challenges. Hello, Akanimo. Please wave at our participants. Rebecca Freeth, she's also Dr. Rebecca Freeth, is a dialogue facilitator and organizational development practitioner and writer. Rebecca specializes in designing and facilitating multi-stakeholder dialogues, scenario exercises, and social labs on issues that really matter. She pays particular attention to power and the dynamics of change. Hello, Rebecca. And our third panelist is Monica Genya. She's a dear friend of Reos. And Monica is director of association and board support at Médecins Sans Frontières, popularly known as MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, Southern Africa. Monica has worked with MSF for over 29 years, and in her previous role as the association coordinator, Monica actually spearheaded MSF's effort at dismantling structural racism in MSF Southern Africa between 2020 and 2022. The three-phase project supported by Reos focused on unpacking some of the historical legacies of racism, how racism manifests as barriers to inclusion and belonging in MSF, and how to transform the organizational structures, policies, and cultures towards greater equity. Welcome, Monica. I'm delighted to see your faces on screen. So, to our attendees, I really want to say we are appreciating all of you joining us from across the world. And I really want to encourage you, as you listen to Rebecca, Monica, and Akanimo today, please put your questions in the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen or in the chat, and share your provocations, comments, or reflections. We really want to bring you into this conversation and not have you as simply bystanders. And the structure of the conversation will really be spending time we'll first spend some time on the theory of structural racism and establish some shared understanding and language. Then we'll hear from Monica on the background of her work with MSF and this project in specific, and then transition into a three-way conversation between the three of them. And then, which I think will be my favorite part, is bringing you all into the conversation. We have people in the background paying attention to what you're putting in the chat and making sure that I'm paying attention to bringing those reflections into the conversation. So alas, before we start, we'd like to get a sense of your thinking as it relates to structural racism. We're going to use the Mentimeter platform, and my colleague Nombulelo is going to paste a link into the chat. And please click on that link and answer that question. And the question is, what comes to mind, or what words come to mind when you think about structural racism? You'll have various opportunities, so you can share a number of words, a lot of words come up for you, but what words come up for you when you think about structural racism? And I'm excited to see some of your musings. So what are some of the words that come up when you think about structural racism? Personally, I think it's a great place to start just to understand how people are thinking of dismantling structural racism. Nombulelo, could you please share the link to the poll in the chat? Yes. So let me make sure that everyone can see it. Give me a second. There we go. I think it's great because we're able to sort of establish what comes to mind, where are you situating yourself when you think about structural racism? Processes. Embedded inequity. Mm. 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 White supremacy is coming across really strongly. And I see your reflections in the chat as well. Inequality embedded into systems. Mm. I mean, there's so many words that we can think of that really you can link or relate to structural racism, which I think also speaks to the breadth of the topic that we're discussing today. Mm. Hidden. Yeah, I'm really appreciating that word, hidden. Mm. Thank you, everyone. This has really been helpful. The nature of structural racism, I think, is that you can see it, and in some cases you can't see it. So it's, to me personally, very enlightening to see how we're all experiencing it in different ways and how what words come up for us. And I think I'm gonna use this opportunity, thank you, Nombulelo, to hand over to people who've really been working on this and spent a lot of time paying attention to what dismantling structural racism might look like. So I'll start with you, Kanimo.
Thank you, Pinale. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to be on this conversation. It's not nice because it's really interesting to talk about racism, as we have seen in some of the words that you have just put in the meeting today. It's quite a problem, dealing with these issues of inequities, issues of dehumanization and oppression. So it's not a nice thing to talk about, but it's nice that we are talking about it. And I think that is a positive energy that I want to bring into this conversation. That we think it is important and worth our time. And we have devoted this time to engage and learn and think together about this very tenacious problem. So I'm pleased, that increasingly many organizations are taking this seriously and beginning to recognize, the impact and the legacies of structural racism. And, one word that struck me, I think it was one of the first words there, is processes. It takes a lot of time, to dismantle structural racism. It requires a lot of effort, a lot of resources, and immense commitment from everyone, across the hierarchy of the organization to really tackle this problem. And, because of the tenacious character of structural racism, we have found that the framing of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's useful, but it's quite limiting to what can be captured. When we talk about and begin from the point of view of recognizing that we live in a structurally racist world, and it feels like it's a direct consequence of that many of organizations, or almost all organizations, imbibe aspects of structural racism. This conversation, at least to my mind, is not a space of pointing fingers and allocating blame. There is enough of that to go around. In a sense, when I think about my own process of uncovering myself and doing my own work, coming from Nigeria, where, there are no white people, but, there are many systems and institutions that are structurally racist. So I guess a useful framing that I and we employ in our work is to shift the emphasis, slightly away from thinking about white people as, perpetrators of structural racism, to think about, the ideal of whiteness, and this ideal expresses itself in norms of white supremacy, some of the words that showed up here, norms of oppression, unbalanced power, and it comes to the enormous trauma, and there was the word trauma in that Mentimeter, So how do we really begin to tackle this problem? My hope is that, we can begin to sort of see anew and see together, during this time. And when I was looking at the Mentimeter, I was, in a sense, scared. I'm like, we could write a book on each of these words, whether we want to talk about oppression, talk about, dehumanization, barriers, traumas, the fear that comes with even naming, that we have a problem, So I'm saying that to say that there's a lot that we could talk about, and we will not talk about all of these things. But I think we will hopefully, stimulate and provoke new thinking, or maybe, help you see something that you would otherwise not have seen, So that is my ultimate hope. So I would say two things to just to conclude this introductory remark. I'm sure, you're also quite interested in hearing from other people. The first one is, why we think that it's important to talk about structural racism in organizations. And, I don't want to give kind of a dogmatic all-in-all answer, but I think this framing allows us to capture, the sort of problems that structural racism enables. And this problem I think of as a problem of stuckness, the problem of polarization, and the problem of alienation in organization. And stuckness, in a sense, is what keeps marginalized people, in marginalized places. It's almost like a loop. You can't really escape. Expressing itself in discriminatory practices, unequal education, where people live. And I'm calling in from Johannesburg, and the history of apartheid in this country is still very alive. And apartheid was a structurally racist system of governance. People are still living in what is called townships, and they are access to education is quite impeded because of where they live and the history of that policy. So when these people come into the workplace, they are seen as, in a sense, incompetent, and that loops, sort of reinforces itself. And with this happening, it creates polarization. People begin to see, oh, us and them. There is white people and there is, these people who are not very privileged. And recently, for those who are calling from South Africa, I'm wondering whether you saw the news of Nedbank, one of the biggest banks in South Africa, firing the human resource executive, which interestingly is a Black woman who said that Black people are lazier and sort of incompetent, in comparison to white folks. And this is not just an individual kind of thing. It fits into a kind of a structurally racist world that we live in, where this access to opportunities creates this kind of polarization. And even those who sort of get into the workplace, attain good position, there is a feeling of sort of alienation. And this alienation is feeling like I don't belong here. This is not my place. I don't trust this institution. I don't feel at home here. I can't be myself here. I see that, there is kind of a unequal power balance and distribution of goods. There is kind of inequity in how goods and burdens are distributed. It's not shared in an equitable way. And people feel like, my norms, my values are not expressed, do not find expression in this organization. And I think it's an unjust thing to happen to anyone, to be in a place where you feel like, your very sense of self, is impacted. So that is, the first thing I want to say. These three sort of problems motivates for why we take this seriously. And the last thing I would say, just as an opening, is, on our use of language. Throughout this conversation, we will perhaps talk about white people, people of color, indigenous people, colored people. These are not universal terms, and the acceptability are, in many cases are contested. For example, the term colored, in South Africa is a distinct racial and cultural group. And if you say that in other parts of the world, people are like, wow, how dare you say that? You can't say it in certain parts of the world. So I guess I'm inviting us to be mindful of the context. I think meaning, I was thinking about this and people say, and I think meaning is contextual. We make sense of things in context. So let's hold the context of where we are situated as panelists, where you are situated, which is also very equally important, as we have this conversation. And there are certain things that we might say that in your part of the world, you're like, how can you say that? In Nigeria, colloquially, it is acceptable to call people of sort of mixed race. We call them, half caste. And even people would say, oh, I'm an half caste. And, in certain parts of the world, that is totally unacceptable. But even people themselves, and it's, so it's, I guess I'm drawing our attention to the importance of paying attention to your own context, to our own context, and to our positionality as we come into this conversation. So I guess my initial job was just to lay this ground, and I will invite my colleague Rebecca in to sort of share some insights on how we describe structural racism, in organizations. And maybe Rebecca, I would invite you to say something why we use the word description rather than a definition. Sometimes I think people miss that we do not attempt to define it, but we want, I think, description allows us to uncover the layers, of this very tenacious beast that we think of. So Rebecca, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Akanimo. And what we found in doing this work is that we would work with groups of people in organizations, and people kept saying, oh, what is structural racism again? We just kept kind of circling back because there wasn't a strong enough definition, and it kept getting in the way of the conversation. And when we looked for good definitions, they didn't really stick with people. So we decided to develop our own. And as you say, we call it rather a description, a 6-part description, because we don't want to get too technical. We actually want to help people see themselves in this description, to recognize it in their own organizations and therefore relate to it. And as we've tested it with people, we have found that people are saying exactly that. You know, I recognize myself here. I feel validated. So please check it as well, because this is still in formation. If you feel like we can keep improving it, please do let us know in the chat. So the first part of it is that structural racism in organizations really refers to ways of thinking, feeling, being, and doing that are all deeply woven into the fabric of an organization. It could be implicit or explicit, but structural racism routinely creates the sense of unearned benefit for white people and routinely creates disadvantage for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And what that means is that many of you, for example, in the word cloud, talked about policies. You recognize structural racism at the policy level. Others spoke about processes. And that's absolutely right. Structural racism shows up in organizations through the policies, such as HR policies, through practices, such as how people are promoted or exposed to opportunities, and through procedures, how budgeting is organized, how business decisions are made. And so what we're recognizing, if we move on to the next slide, is that as a result of these structural disadvantages, it becomes more difficult for Black and Indigenous people and people of color to enter an organization and, as Akanimo said, feel that they belong, feel that they can advance, feel that they're recognized for their excellence and rewarded in material terms as well as in other ways for their work. And as a result of the structural nature, this kind of baked in nature of racism that is so pervasive, but not always explicit, it's often inconvenient or difficult, particularly for white people, to see the impact of structural racism. One can, as a white person, be in an organization and think, oh, we're all equal here. It can also be hard for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color to raise or report experiences so that they can be made available for discussion. There can be accountability. There can be productive and concrete change. So the insidious, often implicit aspects of the structural racism makes it difficult to do these things. And interestingly, it can persist even under Black leadership. You know, Akanimo's example of the HR director is part of that. So a change of leadership at a structural level doesn't mean that racism is automatically fixed. And so we're going to talk about other ways of addressing it that are not just this kind of tokenism that often creeps in. And the last part of this is that while structural racism needs to be addressed at an organizational level, there is also always inner work to be done at the individual and subgroup level by everybody involved, so that we can show up well for the conversations, for the engagement, and for the structural and cultural change that we need to navigate together. And we'll describe it later on what that means what we mean by inner work. Thanks, Mpinane.
Thank you both for those musings. It's a great way to get us started. I'm going to invite Monica. Please come in here. And I think, Monica, what we're really curious about is you're working at MSF and you've been there for a long time. And I guess at some point you decide, hold on, we need to initiate a process to attend to this. And I'd like to hear a little bit from you about why did you initiate this process and what did you do?
Thank you very much. I've worked with Doctors Without Borders, with MSF, for almost 30 years now. It's been a long time. I've never worked anywhere else. It's an excellent organization to work for. A lot of good work is done. But that, while being inside the processes that go on to achieve this great work, we realize that there are certain things that happen that prevent people being included, that prevent maximum diversity that we can get. And we wanted to address that. We really did. I was one of the people who really wanted to. And it isn't just a question, like Dr. Akpan said, of Black leadership or white leadership or leadership of people from different countries or colors. It really was the processes that we had in place. Just recently, I was involved in a conversation. I came across a conversation within my organization where we had noticed that somebody had posted terms of reference for recruiting somebody in a communications department, saying that we're looking for native language, English language speakers, native English language. And it's a word, like Dr. Akpan said, you know, words have different meanings in different contexts. But when you say native English speaker, what are you talking about? Now, I come along as a recruiter. I take native English speaker to mean somebody who was born speaking that particular language. In this case, somebody from the UK, the US, Australia. There are not very many countries where you will find somebody born speaking English in the world. And as a result, I recruit solely people from those countries because I'm anxious to make sure that I do the best job recruiting that I can do. And then what is the result of that? The result is the people in my communications department are all from one part of the world and not from another. And so there is no diversity. And we start asking ourselves, how did we get here? We don't know why the original person who put that terms of reference down specifically said native, but is that fit for purpose right now? What you're actually looking for is somebody who speaks or writes English to a certain level that can easily be tested. And then we can bring in people from all corners of the world to be a part of our communications department by taking down just that simple one word, replacing it with another, and changing that structure. So we wanted to then look into all the little things that make it impossible for people to be included and see how we can start dismantling them one by one. And that's where that started.
Mm-hmm. So I'd imagine that there must have been, it might have been a bit jarring to call it dismantling structural racism. I think there's a lot of other more pale terms that we can go with that don't necessarily evoke so much emotion. So I'd like to hear from you, why structural racism? Why dismantling structural racism? Why call it that?
And thank you for that question. That's very interesting. And I actually sat with a group of people who kept on using this term. They would say, we must call a spade and not a big spoon. And from there, then we came up with, we have to name what it is we're trying to do, and we have to actually name it. And once you name something, once you've given it a name, I think it's less scary. Once you're able to say, this is what I'm talking about, this is what you are, it becomes just that tiniest bit less scary. And we wanted to be very clear about what we were dealing with. So in fact, at the end of the day, what the name was structural racism. So not individual racism and not diversity and inclusion, but actual structural racism. And we decided to go with that and be bold about it. And then in that way, basically get an expected outcome that we could live with.
Mm-hmm. And in the spirit of boldness, I imagine that there must have been some fears, surely, probably your own personal fears and fears of even your supporters. And I'm interested in hearing, what are some of the fears within MSF and among supporters about doing this work? What were some of those fears?
I think the biggest fear is the fear of being misunderstood. So you're trying very hard to do something that at the end of the day, you know, your colleagues and your supporters all want the same outcome. For sure, we all want to get somewhere where people are more included, there is more diversity in leadership, etc. But along the way, there's that fear that the people might think that, you know, somehow this is my fault or my colleague's fault, whose fault is being laid here or there. And that fear is so great, sometimes people would rather just not engage with the topic at all. And so that's the greatest fear. And it's something that has to be addressed right at the beginning, so that you can get people to hold hands and move forward together.
Monica, thank you for getting us started in that context. Akanimo, I'm going to ask you to come in here to share a little bit more around what you had sort of started to talk about an analytic lens, I'd say.
Thanks, Mpinane. And yeah, I will sort of build on what Monica has started to say that, you know, in the work that we did with MSF, we were not just interrogating, you know, whether people feel included or whether there is, you know, what the Black leadership at the top. You know, I think it went beyond that. Perhaps we could say that DI could capture those kind of elements. What we wanted, and we wanted something much more broader and deeper that goes beyond issues of diversity and issues of inclusion. And this led us to develop, you know, for the people who have seen our article, what we call the analytic lens that helped us to think about this in a way that is sort of all-encompassing. And we think that structural racism, you know, shows up along 3 dimensions in organization. And in the work that we did, I think we really paid attention to interrogating each of these dimensions. The first dimension is what we call the systemic roots. And here, you know, the invitation is for us to recognize and situate structural racism within the Western project of slavery, modernity, colonization, genocide, you know, oppression, violence, and, you know, everything that has marked Western modernity, you know, to sort of have that framing. In a sense, you know, the question is to understand and see clearly how Western norms and values, you know, have shaped even the ideas and sometimes even the purpose, you know, of our organization. So how do we just sort of situate it within that broader, you know, sort of much more expansive framing, you know, that we live in a world that is structurally racist, born out of this, you know, project that is called the West. So the West is, you know, in our understanding, it's not just a place. You know, the West is a project. You know, and how do we understand that project? And how do organizations, you know, fit into that project? You know, that is the West. So that is the first dimension. The second dimension, you know, and there are sort of strategies to sort of advance or dismantle or sort of address problems at the systemic roots. Some of it might include interrogating the source of our norms, behaviors, and practices, you know, recognizing that, you know, European thought is sort of one of possible thoughts. It's not objective. It's not, you know, there's always this claim, you know, of objectivity. So how can we situate that as, you know, one among many modalities of thinking and being? And the third one is really to move the center. Where is the center? You know, in the work that we are doing with reimagining INGO, the emphasis there is to move the center of development, you know, from it being led and driven and defined, you know, by the North, the West, you know, to say, can the people, you know, redefine what development and humanitarianism and civil society and INGO mean, you know, for them? So how can we move the center away from, you know, this sense of, yes, this is our place where we feel belong to, sort of having multiplicity of centers, you know, to really shift the systemic roots of structural racism. The second dimension is what we call the organizational purpose. And oftentimes people think that organizational purpose expresses itself in the vision and mission of the company. We see that in many cases, those visions and missions are well articulated in a way that is very politically correct. And we sort of call it, call attention to what we call the deep purpose, which lies in the organization's origin story and which may be strongly shaped, by the systemic root dimension. So what is the purpose of us being in the world? What do we exist for? And in the article, we make distinctions between sort of three kinds of deep purposes. The good one, which, I think we say good in quotes. And this is where organizations drive ideas of white saviorism, under the guise of development. And they're like, oh, we are force for good, but underneath it, they are propagating, advancing norms that are Western, but they think of those norms as universal. So sometimes it's very difficult to pick it up. But it's good to also be attentive to catch it. And the bad purpose, expressed itself in sort of what we call the racial capitalism, whose logic is to extract and exploit, people, and it doesn't just need to be people who are in the extractive industry, but even in organizations, how do we think of labor? How do we think of ourselves? How do we think of ourselves, our sense of self in this system? And the ugly one, aims to sort of make inferior all the people that are not, in a sense, white. It's an inferiorization sort of paradigm or drive. And the colonial project was first thought of as a civilization mission. And underneath that was this idea that these are inferior people with no culture, no religion, no philosophy, and we need to serve them. And in different organizations, these three dimensions of deep purpose show up differently, and we wanted a tool that allow us to catch it. The third dimension is, the dimension of culture, and perhaps this is the dimension that DI often captures. And this dimension shows up in the diversity among organizational staff and leadership. It's basically about how people and organization allocate power and resources, and share the goods and burdens of the organization. Whose back is profits made of? How are people compensated for their work? Who are the leaders in the organization? How do people feel being seen and feel a sense of belonging in the organization? So that is the cultural dimension. So the work that we did with MSF was not, I think, went beyond the traditional DI of looking at elements of diversity and inclusion to say, like, even the very purpose, how did this organization start? And we have seen instances where certain NGOs, organizations have said, we cannot transform, we need to shut down, and try and relocate our resources, and because we are just fundamentally, our deep purpose is problematic. Others have tried, to sort of redefine and re-articulate what that purpose or what their purpose is, but I think there are certain instances where we just say to people, I don't think, you can transform this because of the very, very nature of what you're set up to do. So if you are set up to inferiorize, I don't think there is transformation in that dimension, even though you might have Black people in leadership and people feel like, okay, we are doing the work, that is deeply problematic. So I guess, just to give another layer to how we are thinking about these things and the lens that we bring to this work.
And maybe what I can do to bring in the more practical elements. So having done this analysis and these layers that Akanimo talks about, which takes seriously what's under the surface of an organization, and requires some digging to understand how it shows up in that organization. Practically, what that means is that we then worked with MSF and have brought this into other processes. We we worked on 4 approaches, and this is really the name, the title of this webinar is the 4 approaches to dismantling structural racism. And we can think of these also as 4 elements. They're not standalone approaches. All 4 are important to bring into play and in kind of a dynamic relationship with each other. And I'll just name them, and then as we get into the story with Monica, we can maybe give examples of how this worked out in the MSF case. So the first of the 4 elements is convening and enrolling. So practically, what do the leaders of an organization do to bring the organization into these conversations? And this is Monica's role as a lead convener at MSF. So listen closely to what she did in her convening role, because there are some very skillful ways of holding an organization through this process, often when there's resistance. The second element is this element of engaging. So this is where the kind of the conversation happens. And just to be clear that it happens in multiple patterns. So it could be that the whole organization gathers for certain moments. It could be that there are affinity or identity groups that meet to talk more without the gaze of the other, to really explore what's going on for us. What's going on for us as people of color? What's going on for us as white people? Let's do our work so that we can come back into the conversation with a bit more understanding, a bit more readiness, a bit more healing, perhaps. There are also individual exercises and practices that need to be done. And often the onus falls on white people to do our work well, to work with our fragility well, so that we can show up in these conversations and not hold them back. And so that's the second element, engaging. The third element is institutionalizing structural change. So this is where tangible change gets implemented on the back of some of the understandings and appreciations that have happened during the engagement and enrollment process. So, you know, what does this mean for who is in leadership? What does this mean for our policies? What does this mean for our procedures? And then the fourth element is about navigating cultural change. Because you can, as we mentioned earlier, you can do all of the structural work. You know, you can change the leadership profile, but if you haven't done the work of, exactly as Akanimo talked about, addressing the legacies, working with the deep purpose, the legacy stories, the impulse to white saviorism, unless you've really looked at that and had the conversations and found new ways of being together, new ways of expressing a purpose that everybody can sign up to, etc., you get stuck. And so those are the 4 elements. And I think with that, Pinani will hand back to you to take us into some storytelling.
Yes. I mean, the chat is quite lively already, thinking about some of the tensions that you might have been experiencing throughout the process, Monica, either in the background or in the process itself. And I'd like to hear from you. Let's talk about some of the tensions around these 4 approaches that Rebecca's just shared. And I just want you to dive in naturally into the conversation and don't let me pass the baton, but really, I know you all have quite good chemistry. So please, let's dive into some of those tensions.
Yes, thank you very much. If we look at how we get people on board, that is in fact the very beginning of things and has to be handled very carefully. And what we did was to have a 2-pronged approach. So there are certain elements that we felt needed to be mandatory, certain conversations that had to be had, and we were aware that might cause some resistance, some resentment, but we felt very strongly that needed to happen. And then beyond that, we left it up to people to see how deeply and how much they wanted to engage with it going further. But what we found is once we had those first kind of mandatory engagements with people, that we were able to take a huge percentage of them along with us down the road, who were very interested in seeing what happens next. And we went to people and asked them what they thought and what they had seen and what they felt and what There were a lot of conversations. This was over months and over years even of conversations where people were able to be heard finally, and then try and gather some of those conversations into groups that were similar. So this falls under processes, this falls under policies, this falls under culture, this falls under something else. And then start dealing with them in those ways under kind of bigger banners. And then we got a lot of enthusiasm from people who wanted to do the work to get this done. So at the very beginning, the kind of convening and enrolling was two-part, mandatory in some cases for some subjects, and then after that, completely voluntary, and still is.
Mm-hmm. And Monica, that word mandatory, I recall, was quite an issue of contention. Can you say a little bit more about that decision to initially start off with mandatory and then essentially hope that people will want to come along with more non-mandatory engagements?
Yes, absolutely. There were a lot of discussions about this, and we had a group of people who felt the leadership should be the first people to show leadership by making it mandatory for them to have these discussions amongst themselves. And I think it was the right time. Sometimes everything is about the timing of something. And it was the right time for our leadership to say, yes, we absolutely want to do this at a local level, at regional level, and at international level. So MSF is present in over 70 countries around the world. And everywhere around the world, the leadership agreed that this is something that they want to see done. And then agreed amongst, with some conversation, but agreed amongst themselves that it would be mandatory to engage in this kind of conversation, in this kind of work at leadership level. And then once that was made very clear, the rest of the organization said, well, if it's happening at that level, then we agree to kind of take it seriously at other levels as well. And then that word mandatory didn't bring so much of the sting with it after that. It was a very long process. When we first started it out, myself and my general director thought it would be over in 3 months. We're like, we're going to solve this. It's done. We're just going to tell people this is how we're going to do it, and it's done. And when we partnered with Reos, they're like, and it wound up being a 3-year process. It's not finished. It's just started, but at least we have the tools to be able to make it happen within the organization.
I wonder about element 2. What are some of those tensions around engaging?
There are a lot of tensions that are related to people wondering if this is going to affect their work and how it will affect their work. Like I said, we do very good work, and here's another thing that I hear a lot from my colleagues. If it's not broken, why are you trying to fix it? and then you have to explain why it might actually be broken. It's just not being seen at this level or that level, and so there really is a need to fix it. So engaging with people within the organization, from my side and from the rest of our leadership, had a lot to do with asking for help. We've identified this. How do you feel about that? Can you help us do something to make our organization better? Not just for the people who work within it, but for the people who support us and for the people who are our community, our patients. At the end of the day, can only be a good thing. So there's a lot of engagement that has an expected outcome that people can live with.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, do you want to come in there around some of the white fragility around engagement?
Yeah, I can name a couple of difficulties and tensions that come up in this engagement process. And one is that while naming it, for example, so clearly as Monica, you did, Dismantling Structural Racism, while that is an amazing platform, we get beyond the conversation about is there racism in our organization. It just says you coming into a conversation which assumes and acknowledges that there is structural racism. So let's not get caught up in is there or isn't there. While that can be very empowering for people who have felt up until now that their experience of exclusion and not belonging hasn't been recognized. It can be very validating. There is also an element of sometimes white people coming into those conversations going, am I going to get nailed here? It sounds like I'm going to just get blamed for a lot of stuff. So how do I show, how do I come into these conversations well? And do I even want to? And so that's the difficulty for some white people to figure out, how do I enter this conversation? How do I listen well? How do I not just leap into defending myself? That's other white people. It's not me. I've done my work. So it can be, there's work to be done, let me say it that way, for white people to come into those conversations in ways that don't put their fragility front and center and don't recenter themselves. So that's one tension. A second tension is having kind of parallel affinity group processes, which are about people based on their own self-identified racial identity, being in conversation with each other outside of the listening ear of other groups, so that they can air their dirty laundry, they can say what needs to be said, they can decide, how do we want to bring this back into the bigger conversation? We've experienced that some people really resist the affinity group process, and that's often it's progressives who are the most resistant, people who have spent their lives trying to create spaces that are not kind of racially homogenous. And really, I've always sought diversity or feel that diversity is important. Sometimes the most resistance comes from them because they're like, I didn't do all of this so that I can just end up in a conversation which excludes other people. I showed up. So it takes quite a lot of work to get people into affinity groups sometimes. And again, the proof is in the pudding, but we've experienced that there is enormous scope for healing in those conversations where people can really express their deepest vulnerabilities and feelings in a way that they might not want to in the full group. And so, yeah, those are a couple of the tensions in this stage of engaging.
And there are a lot of questions around the engagement and the convening, but I want to hear a little bit about the tensions before we get into questions around that institutionalizing piece, because there's a comment in the chat, and I believe it might be from Stuart, talking about you have to get on with your work. So how do you do that and also navigate this? And I'm interested in hearing what those tensions were when you needed to now institutionalize structural change within your organization.
Yes, so once we had an expected outcome, there had to be a way to get to that outcome. And our leadership understood that we were not going to get there without actually putting resources into it. The same way is if you want to, teach students, you have to have teachers. So if you want to get to a point where you are changing policies and processes, you have to actually put the resources into that to make that happen. So this was part of a strategic plan that was put in place, not just by us at the Southern Africa level, but by the entire organization, that a portion of our resources would be set aside for a certain amount of time to tackle this head on. So this has to be done. We still have a lot of tensions. We still have people saying there's so much that you're asking us to do, and we have our regular jobs and so on and so forth. We tried to make it as less intrusive as possible, but sometimes we do have to remind everyone that we made a decision that this is going to get done. So we need to just try and find a way to manage our time, to balance our time in order to achieve what we set out to do. The tension is still there. I don't think it'll ever go away, but the agreements that we made at the start of the process were very helpful, so that we can keep going back and touching on them and reminding people that this is where this is coming from.
And perhaps to add to that, Pinane, if I may,
Thanks.
one other thing that I found helpful that MSF did is the whole approach of very broad engagement, that sort of enabled shared ownership, of the problem. So one approach would have been to force it. Maybe the 3 months process that you envisioned, Monica, was, where you're like, okay, this is what needs to be done. You force change, but taking this very participatory, co-creative stance, allowed people to see the importance of this work, and Monica, you haven't mentioned this, but after the process, so we were involved for the 3 years at varying levels. In the first year, I think we did 80% of the work, and MSF internal staff did 20% of the work, building their own capacity to carry on after us. In the second year, it was 50-50, and the second year we did 20%, and MSF did 80%, and we stepped out. But after stepping out, you ended up establishing what you call the DSR unit that works closely with HR to review, even like when, I'm not sure what you call them, the directors have their annual plan and their budget. There is almost a requirement that those plans must be anti-racist, and this is reviewed, by this unit along with HR, to ensure that, this is embedded. So it's kind of an embedding stance to ensure there is continuity, and the facilitators, the internal facilitators, are still doing the work and convening conversations. So it's, even though we are out, it's still an ongoing process, and I think it survived because of how it was started, just enabling that shared participation and ownership of the process.
There are a lot of questions, and I'm really trying to resist the temptation to dive into the questions, and a lot of your comments are already touching on some of that, but I want to really close off on this piece of tensions related to cultural change within an organization. And how do you navigate that?
I think, once you start working on processes and policies, at the end of the day, that really doesn't change things. It really is how people then respond to that. It's that cultural shift that is actually the heart of what makes the organization change. So I did see a question in the chat. How did you know that things were changing? In fact, how do you kind of measure that? And there are certain things that you can measure. For example, our leadership group changed from being 50% people from one ethnic group or 80% one ethnic group to being much more diverse after putting certain processes in place and over a period of time. So you can actually see that, you could track that. But beyond that, we went from having conversations where everybody was looking terrified to calling for a meeting to discuss dismantling structural racism, and people saying, "Yay, that's great that we haven't had this conversation in a while. Let's do it. Let's get out there and do it." And also to having leaders who can speak kind of with experience and authority on how to get this done, going round to the rest of the movement and making this known to the rest of the movement and helping the rest of the MSF international movement come along. So, but when it comes to the cultural shift, it really is from people who are very tense and very upset about having to. It's an upsetting subject. It really is. Having people really upset when you bring it up, to having people want to speak about it, get enthusiastic about the work that goes with it, kind of make it a normal, everyday activity, part of their work. And somebody else says, how do you go from having kind of like a DSR unit that deals with this specifically to having it being a part of everybody's work? And like Dr. Apan said, you basically then have to put it in everybody's annual plans and have people report on what do you plan to do next year to help this work, and have people say, this is the creative idea that I had, and then come back and say, I completed that. So everybody makes it a part of their work.
Yeah, I mean, this relates. I'm going to move into some of the questions here because I know that everyone wants to dig in, and I'd love to hear from you. Monica, you've started to answer Ricky's question from earlier, and he was saying one of the barriers to doing this work in the investment of time and resources that's required. All of you have touched on this. And organizations want to know that such an investment has real benefit and positive impact. So you've talked a little bit about the impact of MSF, but can you say the MSF process? But Ricky's question is saying, what were the impacts of the MSF process, including unexpected negative impacts?
I think with every process that you really hope for the best, but there are always going to be unintended consequences. There always are, and sometimes we find ourselves trying to overshift and trying to shift the balance back to where it is a balance. When we're doing work to dismantle structural racism, we're not trying to exclude people who have previously held positions that we would like to make more diverse and things like that. But we have seen in times that with a lot of fervor in our work that it kind of starts overbalancing in that way, and we have to come back and say this work has to include everyone. I saw in the chat earlier, somebody had talked about unearned benefits and how we shouldn't talk about unearned benefits. People go to school, people go to university, people go to internships and apply for jobs, and it's not unearned when they get that job, whoever you are and from wherever you are. But then I would say the unearned benefit is that you got the job because you were a native English language speaker from Australia or from the UK. We didn't set out, earning where we were born at the end of the day. So maybe that could be an unearned benefit, and it works in all ways. Were you born here? Were you born there in Australia or in Rustenburg in the Northwest in South Africa? And that's why you got the job. That might be unearned. But what we're saying is, let's make it so that everybody can go to school, go to university, get an internship, apply for a job, and be at the same level to get the job at the end of the day, without shifting it too much in this direction or in that direction, and overbalancing in one way or the other. So the unintended consequence can sometimes be shutting out people that we didn't intend to shut out.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe
go ahead, Rebecca.
A word about, well, it'll be more than one word, but a few words about unearned, that question about unearned from my own experience, because when I think about unearned privilege, I think about myself having been born white in a world that promotes whiteness and gives lots of advantage to whiteness. And so that then set me on a path in terms of socioeconomic status and access to education, access to opportunities, etc. I didn't do any work to earn my white skin in the first place. I got it for free. And so we use the word unearned to mean that there are places where, there are more places of more earned privilege where people are doing a bit of work to get privilege. But I didn't do anything to get a white skin that got me to that place of advantage. And what it means then is, because there was a question about shame, is if I have unearned advantage, the point of recognizing that is not to go into shame and not to go into retreat and disappearing and saying, I'm not, I should in some ways disappear from these conversations because of all of my unearned privilege. The point is, I've got it. I can't really give it away. How do I own it well? How do I hold it well? How do I hold it with, what's the responsibility that comes with unearned privilege? And so it's not a stepping out, it's a stepping in, but with the question of, okay, how do I do this? How do I exercise this unearned privilege with awareness and responsibility?
Mm, mm. I really like Stuart's question about, have you achieved, underachieved, or surpassed the stated strategic objectives regarding dismantling racism within MSF? And who else in the sector are you now working with to share your cultural and logistical learning?
Thank you, Stuart. I think that we have achieved a lot of the on paper things that we wanted to achieve. And this is a feeling. I think there's a cultural shift as well. So that is really good for us. I don't think that we've surpassed our objectives. We had very lofty ones. And I think that we're working towards them all the time. So in some cases, the things that you could quantify, we're able to say, we did this and we did that, and we feel happy with that. And the rest is a work in progress that will continue, I think, might never end, in fact. And who else in our sector are we working with? At the moment, we're really working within our international movement. It's huge. Like I said, we're present in over 70 countries around the world. And what we're doing from our jump off point here in Southern Africa is to take that around the world to our networks within MSF and also closely related to MSF, just to share what we found works and what might not work or didn't work for us. And we know that every context is different, so it might not work in different countries or in different regions, but we're sharing that as much as we can. I think somebody also asked if this is out there somewhere. We do have reports that we have shared on our websites that we could probably track down and share with anybody who wanted to see. We have made it very transparent, our heartbreaks as well as our victories, and we're happy to share how we went through it.
I think we'll definitely include links to those in our after webinar email. Akanimo, Esther has a question in the chat, and she said, could you give advice on how to navigate an educational approach by leaders with more meaningful and pragmatic involvement, like dismantling structural racism? And for me, what comes to mind is some of the game changers, as we called them. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the leadership incubator.
Yeah, thanks, Pinane. I'm trying to track down that question. So if you find it, please put it in the chat for me that I can respond to it. But I think, Monica, you have spoken to the importance of, and it was quite inspiring, the importance of having leaders on board and driving this change that we want to see in the organization. It's kind of a top-down, bottom-up approach, being in a dance between, sort of inspiring from the top, but also doing the work from the ground. And I think that is the approach, that is strategy that we employed. And in our case, in our instance, people wanted to see leaders make sort of bold commitments. They wanted to see that we could trust these people. To sort of, do the work. And in MSF, when we got to the point of trying to institutionalize these cultural and structural changes, we came up with what we call game changers. Monica, I think there were about maybe 6 or 7 of them, and one of it was on, removing the barriers to leadership. And in a sense, so it was kind of a backward-looking strategy of, there are people who are capable of being leaders, but there have been barriers. How do you remove those barriers? And there was also a forward-looking strategy of acknowledging that given the history of this country, given where we are, there are certain other barriers that people come into the organization with. How do we support them and get them ready, to assume leadership position? And of course, assuming leadership position means that, certain people had to let go of power, so that for new people to step in. And of course, that is not an easy thing for people to let go of power. A friend said to me recently, Kanemo, power is not the sort of thing that people let go of, and it has to be wrestled. He said young people must wrestle for it, and I think there was a kind of a productive, and I call it a generative wrestling, And I think of, the metaphor of football. I used to play soccer when I was much younger than I am now. And I think it's that tension of being in conflict and in connection in the field of play, wrestling, and it's a generative force. So I don't think there's something wrong with kind of a productive generative wrestling. So coming to your question, our education organization is getting entangled in education, being mandatory rather than partnering. So in the work that we did, we were of the firm belief that education alone will not shift the dial. It's not enough to just bring people and just give them the conceptual tools. Okay, this is what racism is. This is what bias is. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. There are other important elements that should accompany education or learning. And in Reos, we talk about this approach of engaging the head, the heart, and the hands, and sometimes even the feet, and the feet being, how do we really embed, the change? The head work is, this education work, learning new concepts and theories and all of that. But the hard work is, the hard work is where I think it's the crux of the work, learning about yourself, self-awareness, understanding other people, and growing in empathy, whether it's cognitive or emotional empathy. And the handwork is, what can I do now? What can I do now to shift something in myself, but also shift something in my context, in my organization? And how do I embed this work in my organization? That is a fit work. So yes, I guess my advice would be to let's learn, but let's go beyond learning. And the hard work, I think one of the strategies we employed was to get people to tell stories, but that needs to be done carefully in a way that, we do not re-traumatize people. So our approach is very trauma-informed, and we hold, spaces that allow for sort of generative rather than degenerative storytelling that just empowers and builds rather than tear down. But let me stop there. I hope I've answered that question.
Thank you, Akanimo. There's an anonymous question in the Q&A section, and it says, what is the difference between addressing structural racism and practicing anti-racism? And there are a couple of these questions that are sort of trying to understand the difference. There's also another one about tribalism versus racism, and there's another one about affirmative action. And I don't know who can sort of address some of these languagings and differences if you see.
Well, I can take a first stab at that. Sorry, Dr. Akpan. Basically, when you talk about tribalism or racism, and I think somebody had put in the chat, othering, basically what you're saying is, I am from this country, I am from this tribe, I am of this color, I am a short person or a tall person or whatever, and anybody who is not like me is somehow, doesn't measure up, is inferior. There's that bias that we kind of have. The work that we're doing actually, when we talk about structural racism, I might be othering people who look exactly like me, because the policies in my organization were written at a time when perhaps that made sense. We don't know. It was so long ago. Nobody knows anymore. We know they're not fit for purpose now. But that's the difference. Is at the end of the day, just like the person at Nedbank, I don't know what led to those circumstances, but we are brought into an organization, and certain things, policies and processes are so embedded in us that we find ourselves espousing things that don't make sense anymore. And I don't think that is racism or tribalism. It's structural racism, and it is embedded into policies, and all of us can work on getting that out. I don't know if that answers your question.
Rebecca, there's one here that I think might be up your alley, and it's really about addressing the fear right away, first thing. Fear about being misunderstood. What does that look like, and how did you handle this in this process?
Thanks, Mpinane. It's a great question. It's you actually, as you start that enrolling process and engaging process, you're trying to build the conditions for people to come in and feel like that they can arrive fully and that they can engage wholeheartedly. And one of the ways there are many ways of doing that. One of the ways is drawing on, there's a lot in the literature and drawing on our own experience of creating some principles or some ways of engaging, offering some ways of engaging that the group can agree to. So, for example, agreeing early on, right from the word go, that there will be discomfort in these conversations, and particularly probably for white people, and be willing to tolerate a certain degree of discomfort, because in the discomfort is often the gold. In that place where you're kind of on the edge of your seat, or you feel the sweat break out on your palms, if you can stick with the conversation for long enough, you often hear something that really shifts your understanding. And so we're asking people right up front to build their tolerance for discomfort, to not slip straight into reactivity when they're uncomfortable, but to hold the process for long enough. I've just lost an AirPod, but I hope you can still hear me.
Yeah, we can.
Ask people to stay for long enough without the reaction, without the defense. There are several of those kinds of principles. Be willing to let the conversation be incomplete when the time is over for this particular part of engagement, with the intention that people keep thinking, keep talking, in their own spaces, informally, that, you'll never feel that the stuff has been beautifully wrapped up and now the work is done. These things often open up new avenues for self-awareness and for structural change. And to encourage people to not seek this like complete closure, satisfaction. It's all, beautifully wrapped up at the end. It's never going to be that. So you create these conditions that enable people to overcome their own kind of fears, their own barriers, their threshold into the conversation, and invite people to build on those kind of terms of engagement, or whatever you want to call them, principles, agreements. And that process is not to be rushed. And the last thing I'll say about it is, people talk about safe spaces, that the ultimate aim is to create a safe space where people who are fearful can engage. We tend to use the word safe enough. It's never perfectly safe. We can't guarantee it. And so we're also asking people to look after themselves, because we all have our own triggers. And the self-awareness part is for people to become aware of their triggers and make sure that they don't fall into a place of harm for themselves or creating harm for others, so that they're tracking their own process really well and know when to look after themselves. So we're asking people to accept that we can only create safe enough conditions, and some people talk about brave spaces rather than safe spaces. So it's the framing that you do up front that allows people to go, oh, okay, it's a bit scary, but I'm here and it's held. This is a well-held space.
Yeah, and I will add to that, Pinane. We observe that there are certain, perhaps let me begin by saying that fear is a real obstacle to progress if not well addressed. And I guess one of the I call it a challenge, one of the challenges of doing this work well is being attentive, to track in real time, the various defenses or various strategies that people are using to not engage in a productive, generative way. And at the end of a process, we came up with what we called sort of the 4 Ds, particularly to people with privileges. And the first D is deflection. We want to talk about structural racism, and people are like, "Oh, I'm from the south of Spain, for example," or "Oh, I'm a woman, I also suffer marginalization. I might be white, but let's not talk about that. Let's talk about sexism. So people sometimes use that to deflect attention from the conversation that we should have. The second one is a sense of defensiveness. Of like, we are good people here, we do good work in like people in MSF state, like we do good work here, and you can't deny that. We cannot be racist because of the work that we do. So there's a sense of defensiveness that sometimes come alive, and there's denial, perhaps linked to defensiveness, sense of denial. No, this doesn't exist here. And there is a dread, sort of deep fear. I'll be seen as a bad person, as a bad actor. But equally, for people who are marginalized or people who are non-dominantly situated in relation to structural racism, there are also certain strategies that they use to obscure, deeper engagement. Sometimes you see people of color fall into a sense of victimhood, and in that place, nothing generative happens. Or a sense of, weaponizing, they sort of weaponize their own positionality, for whatever reason. So it's really having strategies to track and address fear, because we find that when that is addressed, these sort of strategies to deflect, defend, deny, drops, or in a sense they get weakened, because I think the root cause of this thing is people's sense of fear that I will lose my power, lose my privilege, I'll be seen as a bad person. My sense of self would be sort of distorted. So let me employ these strategies to protect myself.
I'm going to take two more questions. And one I'd like to, I think it's directly addressed to you, Kanimo, is Ayanda is asking, in such processes like DSR, what mechanisms are there or should be put in place for those who are perpetual survivors of racism? Because these conversations can get really triggering.
It's a powerful question. It goes back to what Rebecca said, how do we create a safe enough space for people to engage? Recognizing the traumas and the injuries that come with being at the receiving end of these sort of oppressive systems. Part of it is a collective responsibility of people looking after you and ensuring that the conversation is held well, but also part of it is the individual's responsibility of caring for self, hence why we, in certain instances, we didn't force participation, because people needed to be ready, to feel ready, to come into the conversation. What is your also sense of readiness? What is your personal responsibility that you have to engage? So there is a part that is collectively held, and there's a part that, we cannot hold for the individual. And if you're in a conversation and you feel triggered, it's okay to walk out or to say, I cannot engage further. And we allow room for that. So it's not a blanket approach and it's not a forceful approach, because we recognize the impact of this, particularly on marginalized folks.
The time has flown. Time has indeed flown. And I'm going to draw us to a close, but I'd love for our panel to close responding to Arabia's question. And if you could just give us a sentence that responds to he or she's question that says, I wonder whether there are reasons to be optimistic about the demise of structural racism. And Stuart shared some really wonderful musings thereafter, but I'd like to hear from each of you if we indeed do have reasons for optimism.
It's a very difficult one for me. I've not been very, very active on Twitter, I think in the last maybe 4 months, because of sort of the vile and hatred and lack of awareness that people with privilege and power, I think they embody it and wear it proudly. And I've seen, so that is on one hand. On the other hand, I've seen, people make real efforts and that change is possible, exemplified by the work that MSF is doing. MSF Southern Africa started the process, think 2 years ago, Spain invited us to Barcelona to do some work for the leadership. Germany is also thinking about it now. Canada is also thinking. So I think change is possible. If people can begin it, it could sort of have a ripple effect, and this is just in the MSF system. And if you could take this to your organization, imagine the impact, and the ripples it might create. So I am optimistic. And I think it requires us to pull up our socks, and be attentive, be vigilant, and sort of ready yourself, be in the stance, and I think of stance as readying yourself for action. I think one philosopher describes stance as that, being in readiness for action. So we need to embody that stance, to counter it, to interrupt it, rather than being passive agents. So I'm hopeful, and I think change is possible because I've seen it. Yeah.
Monica, Rebecca, any final words?
I would say that it can be really heartbreaking work. There are highs and lows, and there are times when you just don't want to speak about it anymore. It happens. Hopefully this is not everybody's journey, but I can say it has been mine at times. But is it worth it? Absolutely. Is it worth it to fix one thing that leads to something positive for the organization? Then yes. Is it worth it to fix more than one thing? Absolutely yes. And I think that we can all find one thing that can be fixed that will lead to a more inclusive, a better environment, and a place where we all feel happy and proud to be working in. So I think that there is optimism to be had in this kind of work. Absolutely. And yeah, I'm very glad to have been part of it, and I'm glad to continue with it.
Pinani, I'm aware of the time and that we've hit the half hour, so I feel covered by what Akanimo and Monica have said. I don't need to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you for all the questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but I think what we'll do internally is have a look at the questions that you shared and see what we can share with you all bilaterally. And I think, as you've seen in the chat, a recording will be emailed to all of those who've opted in. We are going to be hosting more regular events around some of these tough issues, and do keep in touch with us. We have a newsletter, but also more directly with our panelists or anybody at Reos, and visit our website and engage with some of the other difficult work that we're working on. So thank you so much, and I am very privileged to have been a part of this conversation, and I wish you all well. And thank you to our panelists. Bye. Goodbye.